Today is Tuesday, 9th July, the first day of the NATO summit meeting in Washington, D.C. And it is a summit meeting taking place in a period of crisis. In fact, I'm going to say it straightforwardly, I think this is the worst time for the NATO alliance in its entire history. It's probably too much to say that NATO is facing an existential crisis, but certainly it has never been in more trouble than it is at the moment. Firstly, the leader of NATO, the leader of what used to be called the free world, and what some people, Tony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, for example, still call the free world. Anyway, the leader of the free world, President Biden of the United States, is plunged into political difficulties. There's growing demands from his own party that he step down following his disastrous debate performance against his rival for the presidency, Donald Trump. But the president himself, Joe Biden, is determined to cling on as strongly as he can. The country that is sometimes referred to as the United States' closest ally, which is Britain, is now represented by a new Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and a new Defence Secretary, John Healey, and a new Foreign Secretary, David Lammy. Now, Mr. Lammy has now written a long article in Foreign Affairs setting out his ideas for the future of British foreign policy. And, well, it's a strange mixture of things. He talks a lot about something called progressive realism, whatever that means. Well, he would say it means using realist methods to advance progressive objectives. I've read the article. I've read critiques of the article that have been written by various people, especially one that was referred to me by the historian Jeff Roberts, for which I'm grateful. To me, I have to say, the article looks like more of the same. Lammy acknowledges that there have been mistakes made in the past, that the Libyan war and the Iraqi war and all of those wars were some kind of enormous overreach. But when you drill down and you read carefully through the article, you realize that there's no fundamental rethinking of foreign policy, certainly no wavering from the ultimate objectives, which are the same neoliberal, neocon objectives that we've been living under for, well, the last 30 years. And there continues to be the total commitment to the alliance between Britain and the United States, and the hope or aspiration or desire to preserve the Western-based, US-led order. So I don't see any sign of change there, and I don't see any sign of new thinking there. And of course, Keir Starmer comes to Washington with his team, with his foreign policy team, despite the fact that he has been elected with just 33% of the vote, and though he has a thumping majority in the British Parliament. I think I am right in saying that this is the smallest percentage of the vote won by any British government since the beginning of the 20th century. I might be wrong on this. I haven't done all of the figures going all the way back before the Second World War, but I don't remember any British government being formed on just 33% of the vote. Just saying. Anyway, there we are. That's the Keir Starmer. a strong position, but actually a very brittle position. And Starmer himself, of course, very inexperienced in foreign policy, as, by the way, are the members of his team. But if there are question marks about the British, well, the question marks hovering around President Macron are much, much greater. Now, I've been doing an awful lot of research over the last 24 hours since I did my last video about the French parliamentary elections, and I've come to the view that they are actually a devastating disaster for the French establishment, for President Macron himself, and that they clearly signal the steady shift in the tectonic plates in France. Now, before I proceed, there is something I wanted to say, which is that on a number of comments that I've read on various threads to my videos, people have taken issue with something I'm supposed to have said, which is that Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leader of France Unbowed, arguably the most important part of the Popular Front grouping that has gained the largest numbers of seats in the French National Assembly. Anyway, I'm supposed to have said in some program or other that Mélenchon is a pro-American figure. I don't recall having said any such thing. And in fact, it would certainly not be true. I've been familiar with Mélenchon for quite a long time. Far from being pro-American, he is a relentless and eloquent critic of US foreign policy, going all the way back to the 1970s. Maybe I slipped somewhere, but I wonder whether people are confusing what I said about Raphael Glucksmann, who is Mélenchon's political ally and rival within the Popular Front, with Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Suffice to say that as soon as the results were out of the way, Mélenchon staked his claim to be appointed Prime Minister of France. We'll come to that in a moment. But he's also made comments about foreign policy. He's also talked about Project Ukraine. He says that supporting Ukraine is misconceived, that there needs to be peace, negotiations are essential, any idea that the Russians can be defeated is absurd, sending troops, French troops, to fight the Russians is absurd, and allowing the Ukrainians to launch attacks on Russian positions inside Russia is wrong as well. And this is absolutely what you would expect Mélenchon to say. But anyway, let's not debate Mélenchon. Let's get quickly to the actual results, because the results, now that I've been able to unpack them, are extremely interesting. Now, the first thing to say is that turnout fell between the first and second round. Turnout in the first round was very high, and it slipped somewhat in the second round. And it's not actually difficult to get a sense of the reason why that happened. People get tired after the first round. Some people don't realize, I suspect, that the election is in two parts. But putting aside that, the fact that there is so much horse trading and maneuvering means that amongst the parties who've agreed to stand down candidates and to support the others, well, there's inevitably going to be some people who support that party who are not happy with the horse trading and decide to abstain in the second round. Anyway, let's look at the actual results, because they're very interesting. So in the first round, National Rally, the Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, won 9,379,092 votes. That's 29% of the total vote. Her allies, who were a group of right-wing parties who had come together in the union of the far right. They won 1,268,822 votes. The combined percentage of these two parties is 33%, which is a 33% that would support Marine Le Pen and which would have supported the appointment of the leader of her parliamentary party, Jordan Bardella, as Prime Minister of France. Now, if we look at what happened in the second round, it's actually interesting. So in the second round, the National Rally went down a little. As I said, turnout fell to 8,744,080 votes. But its percentage, its actual percentage of the vote increased. So whereas it won 29.26% in the first round, against the backdrop of a fall in turnout, its percentage increased to 32.05. And the Allied Party, the Union of the Far Right, it actually saw its vote grow. It grew to 1,364,964 votes. So it gained 1,268,822 votes in the first round, and it went up to 1,364,964 votes in the second round. Its vote increased by around 100,000 between the first round and the second round. And I think, by the way, that it is the only party that saw an actual increase in its vote. And of course, it also saw a significant increase in its vote share. Its vote share went up to 5%. So, together, these two parties, the parties that support Marine Le Pen for president, if there were a presidential election in France today, won between them 37% of the votes in the second round, as opposed to the 33% of the vote that they won in the first round. So Marine Le Pen's alliance grew in strength from the first to the second round. Overall, its total votes fell slightly from 10,647,914 in the first round to 10,109,044 in the second round. But there was a significant percentage increase in the proportion of the vote. It went up from 32% to 37%. Now let's look at what happens to the New Popular Front, the party, the left-wing bloc that has now emerged with the largest number of deputies in the French National Assembly. In the first round, it won 9,042,485 votes. And in the second, it won 7,039,429 votes. A significant fall. And well behind the National Rally, and with its 8,744,080 votes in the second round. And of course, if you talk about the combined right got 10,109,044 votes, almost 3 million more than the New Popular Front. Despite that, the New Popular Front now has 180 seats, as opposed to the combined right, which is 132. So, with 3 million fewer votes, the New Popular Front got 50 more seats than the right. And if you're talking about Macron's party, well, they won 6,820,446 votes in the first round. Their vote share was 21.2%. Their vote fell slightly to 6,691,619 in the second round, and their vote share was just 24%, 24.53%. Now, the New Popular Front gained a vote share of 28.21% in the first round, but in the second round, that fell to 25.8%. So, despite that fact, as I said, despite the fact that the Le Pen bloc won 37% of the votes, as opposed to 25% for the New Popular Front in the second round, and 24% for Macron's party. Macron's party won 159 seats, the New Popular Front won 180 seats, and the combined right won 132 seats. So you can see that the results, again, don't reflect the voting. Now, a lot of people are very upset and annoyed about this, but again, it's important to remember that this is the voting system that France has, and it's had it for a fairly long time, and the system encourages horse trading. It is a system that can produce anomalous results like this one, not to the extent, of course, that the British first past the post system produced an extremely anomalous result in the recent British election. But the key point to take away is that it is the right that is growing in strength. It is Le Pen's party that is party, or rather the bloc of voters that support her, which is gradually growing from election to election. And the biggest fall in support has been for Macron's movement. Now, Macron's party, by the way, lost 86 seats in the French Parliament. It's now perhaps not quite a rump, but it is a much diminished force, as is the president himself, as is Macron. Now, that leaves, as I discussed yesterday, a chaotic situation in France. The most popular party, the party led by Marine Le Pen, is excluded from power as a result of an arrangement between the left and the centre-right. Centre-right led by Macron. Now, the thing to understand is that Macron is intensely unpopular, loathed by the left and most of the left's voters. And in the hours after the election, a whole troop of them, starting with Mélenchon, but including various other leaders, including leaders of the Green Party, completely rejected any possibility of the left entering into any kind of coalition or alliance with Macron's party. The only member of the New Popular Front who left open, or appeared to leave open, the possibility of an alliance between the left and Macron was predictably Raphael Glucksmann. Now, this is going to create all sorts of problems because the left says it wants to form the government, but it doesn't have the number of MPs in the French Parliament to form the government, and it's not the most popular political force in France. Marine Le Pen's party is the most popular political force in France. So what is going to happen? Firstly, there's already moves, it seems to me, within the New Popular Front to push Mélenchon to one side, to marginalise him, perhaps to oust him from the effective leadership that he has of the New Popular Front. I think that would be an extremely dangerous thing, by the way, for the left-wing parties that form the New Popular Front to do. Mélenchon is a deeply controversial figure in France. Many people in France strongly oppose him and some dislike him. But he does have a genuine critical mass of support amongst the left-wing electorate in France. And if you actually follow the results of presidential elections in France, in the last three in which Mélenchon has stood, he has gradually increased his vote share as compared with every previous election. In the last election, he almost reached Le Pen's percentage of the vote. He is far and away the most popular political figure on the French left. Just saying. So, shunting him aside, pushing him aside for the rest of the left to enter into a coalition with Macron, a universally disliked president, universally disliked, except amongst the ever-shrinking number of people who support his movement and himself. Well, that would be, for the left, or for any left-wing party that did that, a recipe for total political extinction. I mean, if it's all but impossible to imagine the left supporting Le Pen, it is going to be very, very, well, actually equally impossible to get many left-wing voters to accept an outcome where left-wing deputies in the French National Assembly prop up a government of the centre-right, of the neoliberal centre-right, ultimately picked and supported by Emmanuel Macron. Now, I understand, however, that that is Macron's plan. He's looking for ways, in other words, to break up the New Popular Front so as to draw some of its deputies to get them to combine with his party in the hope that that will finally secure a majority. Well, it may succeed. If it happens, then what I'm going to say is very straightforwardly, we're going to have a sense of even greater crisis and disillusionment amongst the French electorate. And unless there is a sudden and complete transformation in the condition of the French economy, which no one expects, then it seems to me that an angry, disillusioned electorate feeling itself increasingly betrayed is going to become even more likely to vote for Marine Le Pen in 2027 in the presidential and parliamentary elections, which are all but certain to happen in that year. Now, I don't know whether Emmanuel Macron himself understands this. he has shown an astonishing blindness to the currents of French opinion. And I think that his vanity makes it difficult for him to accept the fact that France is slipping away from him. I think, on the contrary, now that he's achieved the result in the election that he has, he's confident that he will be able to break up the New Popular Front. He might even be right about that. And he's also confident that he can form a government that will support his policy lines, including perhaps on Project Ukraine. Deeply unpopular, massively repudiated, though that has been, on the part of French voters. I think he will manage to crumble the New Popular Front, but I doubt that enough left-wing deputies will go over to his side to enable him to form a majority. So we're going to have an unstable, chaotic and weak government in France, and a president who is increasingly detached from reality and who has lost control. This is the president who represents the third nuclear power in the West that is participating in the NATO summit, which is just starting in Washington. I have to say, looking at this, looking at the way in which the three big military powers in NATO, the United States, Britain and France, are all in deep political trouble, reflects the trouble, or so it seems to me, of NATO as a whole. And of course, the other key country, which is Germany, also, it seems to me, they're in serious trouble. The European Parliament elections also appear to show a general repudiation of the parties of the governing coalition, which has taken such a strong line supportive of Ukraine. And I'm going to say straight away that though the only part of Germany that I visited was the Rhineland, a former SPD area, the impression I got whilst I was there is that even in this former SPD heartland, that revulsion against the government in Berlin and its policies, specifically its policies with respect to Ukraine, is now very widely shared and is becoming systemic. So, all the big four, United States, Britain, France, Germany, they're all badly led by leaders who lack authority and lack credibility, who are out of ideas, and in the case of the President of the United States, probably unable anyway to form ideas. The trouble is that in this drift, the situation for NATO continues to become more dangerous and continues to deteriorate. And we got an example of how, in this vacuum, decisions are being made without apparently the big players really exerting any control over them. Decisions are being made which potentially could open the way for the big countries, United States, Britain, France, and Germany, to get themselves into much greater trouble in Ukraine, over Ukraine, than they have been up to this point. Now, I've been saying in program after program that the military situation in Ukraine is becoming catastrophic, that those who are not following the war closely, who do not have a granular understanding of what is actually taking place in the war, probably do not understand how bad the situation for the Ukrainian army has now become. Suffice to say, and I'm going to discuss things in a little more detail shortly when I do my military update, but suffice to say that we're now starting to get reports that in the Avdiivka or Cheretino sector, the fabled 47th Mechanized Brigade, perhaps the elite brigade of the Ukrainian army, the one that was trained and equipped with Western weapons in order to spearhead Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, the brigade which Ukraine has constantly used as a kind of fire brigade, sending it from one difficult part of the front to another in order to stabilize the situation as the front starts to crumble. Anyway, we're now starting to get the reports that the 47th Mechanized Brigade is not only starting to lose positions, which has been doing that for a long time, but that its soldiers are engaging in unauthorized retreats, that they are retreating from positions which the High Command in Kiev has wanted them to defend, and it's been forced to do that because the scale of its losses mean that to the extent that it's got its personnel are kept up to strength, its personnel have been diluted by reservists who lack the motivation of the earlier soldiers. Most of them are either dead or wounded or exhausted and demoralized themselves. And that's just one unit. There's more reports in more and more places of things starting to crumble, starting to get weaker for the Ukrainians on the battlefronts. And one person who must be aware of this at some level is President Zelensky. Now, President Zelensky has categorically ruled out negotiations with the Russians. As I recently discussed, the Azov Brigade has now directly threatened him in the event is saying to him that if he were to engage in direct negotiations for the Russians, if he were to make concessions to end the war, well, he would face bad outcomes, which is almost as clear a threat as you're likely to get. So Zelensky is finding himself, as I said, in an increasingly difficult situation. Things are slowly falling apart around him. It's clear that at the NATO summit meeting, whatever promises are made to Ukraine, the NATO states are not going to rush through Ukraine's entry into NATO, nor are the NATO states going to come directly to Ukraine's rescue. At least that's their stated position. And, well, the fabled military equipment that they have been providing is failing. We will come to that shortly. Anyway, Zelensky, finding himself in this very desperate situation, has gone to the capital of the country which has been his closest ally in the war, despite periods when there's been great tension, even with the people and government of that ally. Anyway, he's gone to Poland, and he's had meetings there with the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, and he made an announcement whilst in Poland that Ukraine has given permission to Poland to shoot down over Ukrainian territory any Russian missiles that appear to be heading towards Poland. Now, this looks to me like Zelensky trying to get the Poles to establish some kind of no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. There haven't actually been many Russian missiles entering Poland. Apparently there was one case when a Russian missile did actually enter Poland and land on Polish territory, though it did no damage. There was an earlier instance when what was described or misdescribed as a Russian missile also entered Poland and did do some damage, but it turned out to be, after examination, an Ukrainian S-300 air defense missile that had landed by accident on Polish territory. Both of these incursions clearly were errors. There's no sign that the Russians are at all interested in targeting any object in Poland, or at least not up to now. So why is Zelensky doing this? Well, as I said, the reason is that he wants the Poles to start shooting down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory in order to get the Poles, in effect, to enforce some kind of no-fly zone over Ukrainian territory. So if missiles, for example, Russian missiles, start heading in the direction of Lvov, which is, of course, a city not on the Polish border, but, within some distance of Poland, and a missile that heads towards Lvov has to be moving in an east to west direction, in other words, from Russia and towards Poland. Well, assuming that happens, then of course Zelensky can tell Tusk, and Tusk can decide that this missile might potentially, conceivably, cross the border into Poland, and therefore the Poles might justifiably see this as a threat and therefore shoot it down. Now, that, as we can see, already brings us close to a situation where the Polish air defense forces and aircraft forces start intervening in Ukraine. But of course, there is a further scenario which one mustn't overlook. Now, in a few weeks or months or days, who knows exactly when, Ukraine is supposed to receive its F-16 fighter jets. Ukrainian air bases are looking increasingly unsuited to house F-16 fighter jets. The Russians have shown that they can bomb and strike at these bases practically at will. Any F-16s that are located at these air bases are likely to be destroyed in short order. The Ukrainians themselves have floated the possibility that F-16s might therefore have to be parked, in other words, kept on NATO territory outside Ukraine. Now, most of the speculation has centered on Romania, and the assumption is that it will be in Romania from which the F-16s would operate. But there is also a possibility that they could be stationed in Poland. Now, the Russians have said that if F-16s, Ukrainian F-16s, or F-16s with Ukrainian insignia are based in countries, NATO countries, but nonetheless undertake engagements in the area of the special military operation, the Russians will consider them combatants and will act to destroy them wherever they are based. So if Ukraine is going to station F-16 fighter jets in Poland, then it is possible, then there is indeed a possibility that the Russians might change their policy and might launch missile strikes at those F-16s in the Polish air bases. And then, of course, this whole idea of Poland shooting down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory gets a whole new dimension. Now, it's not obvious to me what the Poles think they are doing by agreeing to this proposal, or shall we say, acknowledging this proposal of Zelensky's. But Donald Tusk is already talking about how, though NATO is not involved in this scheme, it does have implications for NATO, including Article 5 implications. In other words, this whole scheme looks ultimately as if it is another device cooked up by Zelensky and perhaps, and maybe even probably, the Poles to engineer an intervention by NATO, a military intervention by NATO against Russia in the conflict in Ukraine, to get the NATO powers, in other words, to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which has been something that Zelensky has agitated for and has been demanding, well, pretty much from the start of the war. The United States has consistently and always ruled that idea out. They've always said that they are opposed to it. President Biden continues to say that he does not want in any way the United States to be involved in any kind of direct military confrontation with Russia in Ukraine. In fact, in the early weeks of the special military operation, he said that any situation where Americans are fighting Russians is World War III. And I agree with him. And yet, we see that this is precisely the situation that the increasingly desperate Ukrainians and their American ally and their Polish ally seem to be edging NATO towards. And of course, when we talk about NATO, we should be absolutely clear that in terms of any military confrontation against Russia, ultimately, we mean the United States. No European country, no combination of European countries can take on the Russian military in Ukraine on its own. They all know it, and without the United States, if they were absolutely sure that the United States would not be involved, they would never do it. What all of them are thinking, what President Macron was thinking when a couple of months ago he was floating ideas of sending French troops to Ukraine, what Zelensky and Tusk are also thinking is of creating some kind of mechanism whereby Poland will claim that it is under attack from Ukraine by Russia, will invoke Article 5 and will ask the United States to come to its rescue by imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Now, I generally think that the Pentagon doesn't want to do that. I think they understand full well the incredible dangers of such a thing. I doubt actually that most of the other big NATO powers, the Germans, the French, the British, want to go all that way either. But when leadership is so weak, when decisions are made which always push towards further escalation, where there are no talks with the Russians at all and no substantive negotiations, but not even, let's put aside the idea of substantive negotiations, just talks, just communications with the Russians. Well, into this void, dangerous schemes like this one start to appear, and of course they are extremely dangerous. Now, I don't know how all of this is going to play out. I'm going to make a reasonable guess that there will be many, many people in Poland who also do not want Poland to get more deeply drawn into this conflict in Ukraine. In fact, I suspect that opposition to the war, and indeed to the entire direction of policy that's been followed in Poland, both by this government and by its predecessor, is likely to increase. So I'm not saying that all of these dangerous scenarios that I've outlined are necessarily going to happen. My point is that in the absence, it is the absence of strong leadership in the West, of a president in the United States, a prime minister in London, a president in France, and a chancellor in Germany. It is in the absence of strong leaders with a clear understanding of the dangers that these possibilities start to arise and that the dangers from them start to become real. What we're going to get in NATO over the next couple of days, instead, is an ocean of words, massive criticism of Russia, strong support, strong words of support for Ukraine, criticism, by the way, of China as well, which is going to annoy and anger the Chinese even further and make them even less willing to act in ways in Ukraine, in the conflict in Ukraine, that the West might find, might work to the West's ultimate advantage. So we're going to get all of that escalatory language, which opens the way to these escalatory moves, like the ones that the Ukrainians and the Poles have just agreed, but no real sense that the situation is under control. Of great powers, or formerly great powers, that are being led along, that are drifting on the tide of events, rather than actually controlling those events. And again, it's not difficult to understand why we are where we are, because the things that the West imagined it would be able to do at the start of the special military operation, which would transform the situation, preserve Ukraine, defeat Russia, engineer the fall of President Putin, and isolate China. None of that has worked, and everything is going wrong. And these leaders, weak and insecure, not only are unable to acknowledge that, but they have no ideas about what to do about it. Let's talk now about the situation in the military situation, and let's look at the technological aspects of what's going on the battlefronts. There's been this constant assumption in the West that Western weapons are so much more advanced than Russian weapons, that they are going to be decisive game changers in the conflict. And there's been constant pressure to increase the number of Patriot air defense missiles, especially sent to Ukraine, and of fighter jets as well. And a point which people constantly overlook is that just as the ATACMS missiles that the Ukrainians with American assistance have been launching at Russian targets have proved far less effective than was originally expected, so it has proved to be the case as well with the Patriot air defense missiles. Now, let me turn to the events of the day before, when there was the big Russian missile strike on Kiev. The Russian Defense Ministry has now provided its explanation of the missile strike. They said, and this is a statement they released late yesterday, this morning, in response to the Kiev regime's attempts to damage objects of Russian power infrastructure and economy, the armed forces of the Russian Federation, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a group strike by long-range precision weaponry at objects of Ukrainian military-industrial infrastructure and Ukrainian aviation bases. The goal of the strike has been achieved. All the assigned targets have been engaged. Statements of the Kiev regime about the allegedly deliberate missile strike launched against civilian facilities by the armed forces of the Russian Federation are false. Numerous published photos and footage from Kiev clearly confirm that the destruction was caused by a Ukrainian air defense missile launched by an anti-aircraft missile system in the city. We note in particular that similar hysterics by the Kiev regime happen for years and every time on the eve of another meeting of its patrons from NATO. The goal of such provocations is to ensure further funding for the Kiev regime and the continuation of the war to the last Ukrainian. So, the Russians say they carried out a missile strike on Kiev. They say that they attacked industrial facilities in the city. They also say that they attacked air defense installations as well. And they are specifically and expressly and furiously denying that they did launch that missile attack on that children's hospital, which has invited so much comment in the West and so much condemnation from the West. And they refer to photos and footage, and I've seen those photos and footage, and as is always the case, I am not going to claim in any way that I have any authority in analysing or understanding these photos or footage, but I've seen a photograph which purportedly shows what is said to be the missile on its path towards the children's hospital. And I'm not going to claim that I have any ability to identify missiles clearly, and the image of the missile is blurred, but to my wholly inexpert eyes, it does not look like a KH-101 subsonic cruise missile, and it absolutely does not appear to be either a Kinjal hypersonic missile or a Zircon hypersonic cruise missile, or one of the huge KH-22-32 missiles, or Iskander-M ballistic missiles that the Russians also used in this attack. So though, as I stress again, I'm not expert and I'm not authoritative on this matter. I suspect that the Russians here are telling the truth and that this was another case of a Ukrainian air defense missile missing its target and striking a building, on this occasion, tragically, the building of the Children's Hospital. If you want more conclusive proof as to what exactly happened, then the right thing to do is to call for a proper, independent investigation carried out by a neutral third party, of which there are any number, which of course will never be the case. Anyway, all of this talk about the attack on the Children's Hospital has detracted attention from the numerous pictures and images that we now have, taken illegally by the way, showing the Russian missile strike on Kiev underway. Now, most of these pictures focus on the Russian attacks on one building, which is the giant ETHEREUM plant. This is one of the big factories in Kiev, which produces all kinds of industrial equipment for the Ukrainian military. And it was attacked by several missiles, mostly, from what I could see, Kh-101 missiles, subsonic missiles. Now, these are precisely the missiles that the Ukrainians claim that they are able to shoot down in large numbers. And they're also the missiles that the Patriot air defense missiles are supposed to be most effective and successful in shooting down. Well, I was watching film of this, and here I don't think that much interpretation of the film is really needed. I saw no fewer than 3 Kh-101 missiles slam into the ETHEREUM factory without any sign that they had been intercepted in any way by the Patriot missiles. In other words, even in broad daylight, even when using subsonic missiles, the Russian missiles still get through. Ukrainian claims that they shoot down these missiles in prodigious numbers have always seemed to me wildly overstated, and this footage, to my mind, seems conclusively to refute that claim. So, the Patriots, unable to shoot down even air-breathing subsonic cruise missiles in broad daylight, maybe, just maybe, they're not as effective as people in the West constantly say and always believe. Now, I would have thought that by this stage in the conflict, as I said, we've been in a situation now where Patriot missiles have been operating in Ukraine now for over a year. I would have thought that by this stage in the conflict, that would actually be obvious. Yes, Patriots can shoot down Russian aircraft. They can shoot down Russian missiles. They do so regularly and in significant numbers. But they do not provide Ukraine with that foolproof air defense umbrella that people constantly harp on about. The Russian missiles can get through. Now, one reason why they probably were able to get through in Kiev is because of the other part of the Russian attack, about which we have far less information. And that is that one gets the sense that before the subsonic cruise missiles, the Kh-101s, rammed into and attacked the ETHEREUM factory, hypersonic missiles were used to attack the air defense installations located around Kiev. And there are reports that both Kinjal hypersonic ballistic missiles launched by MiG-31 fighter jets and Zircon hypersonic cruise missiles launched by Russian Navy submarines from the Black Sea, that both of these types of hypersonic missiles were used. And there are reports that large numbers of Ukrainian air defense personnel were killed over the course of this strike. And, well, that might have played a role in weakening Kiev's air defenses. In fact, almost certainly it did. But, well, I don't see that alters the previous point I was making, because if in ideal conditions the Patriots perhaps are able to shoot down KH-101s, if they cannot shoot down KH-101s because they themselves are being attacked and destroyed by hypersonic missiles, Kinjals and Zircons, then again they are failing in this war. And that, it seems to me, also is obvious. The West has been steadily increasing its supplies of air defense systems to Ukraine. More and more of them have been heading towards Ukraine. The United States is scouring the world looking for Patriot missiles and Patriot missile systems. It's strong-arming the Israelis to supply Patriot missiles to Ukraine. It's prioritizing Ukraine over other customers. The Norwegians have been supplying air defense missiles. The Germans have been doing so. The French and the Italians have been doing so. And, well, what's the result? In broad daylight, KH-101 missiles are able to smash into the Artyom factory in Kiev in broad daylight. And there's apparently no way of stopping them from doing so. So why continue to invest in failure? Why continue to strip away what is left of the West's air defense systems in order to achieve what in Ukraine? And that again brings us back to the Zelensky-Tusk agreement. Ukraine is going to authorize Poland to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory. With what exactly? With Patriot missiles, of which Poland itself now is in extremely short supply? Or are they going to use fighter jets? Are Polish fighter jets now going to start operating in Ukrainian territory in order supposedly to shoot down the KH-101s? And Polish fighter jets means F-16s. And the Russians, observing this from a distance, might not be able to tell the difference between Polish F-16s and Ukrainian F-16s, and they might decide to shoot down these F-16s, these Polish F-16s, over Ukrainian territory, or, since they might be Ukrainian F-16s, the Russians might know for certain which of the two it is, they might decide to pursue them and hunt them in their bases in Poland itself. Well, we can see the dangerous situation. But let's move on further and discuss other systems which the West has supplied. The HIMARS. Apparently it turns out that the HIMARS system can launch ATACMS missiles and probably is doing so. It seems that the M270 can launch 2, but the HIMARS can launch 1. And the HIMARS, often described as a great game changer. The Russians have now saturated Ukrainian airspace with observation drones. They found 3 HIMARS launchers about to launch a strike, a HIMARS, perhaps an ATACMS strike on Crimea. All of the HIMARS launchers were immediately attacked using an Iskander-M missile, ballistic missile. All 3 of the launchers were destroyed. And the Iskander-Ms are now proving absolutely deadly weapons, being increasingly used by the Russians to attack airfields and high-value targets across Ukraine. And we see again another consequence in bad Western policy decisions. Last summer, during Ukraine's failed, disastrous Zaporozhye offensive, Jake Sullivan, on behalf of the United States, announced that the United States, in order to make up for shortages in Ukraine's number of shells, would start to supply to Ukraine shells with cluster munitions, despite the fact that there is an international convention which aims to prohibit, eventually, the widespread use of munitions with cluster shells. The Russians warned that if the Americans did that, they would counter with cluster weapons of their own. And they are doing so. One of the reasons why the Iskander-Ms are proving so devastating in their attacks on airfields and on Ukrainian convoys and on Ukrainian trains and on Ukrainian HIMARS missiles is because they are now being equipped with cluster warheads. So the missile detonates over the airfield, the road, the railway, and the cluster munitions fall to the ground, and their effect is absolutely devastating. That was how the Russians destroyed or damaged 7 Sukhoi 27 fighter jets in a single airfield in Ukraine with just 1 strike. And that was how they destroyed 3 HIMARS vehicles. And by the way, and on that topic, more film has now appeared just over the last 24 hours, showing another Iskander-M strike with cluster warheads on a Ukrainian convoy in Sumy region, close to the Russian border. There's a huge amount of speculation about what the Ukrainians were doing there. The most widespread view is that they are dealing with an unannounced Russian military incursion into Sumy region. Anyway, whatever it was, the point is that something like 20 vehicles were caught in the open. There was a missile strike on them with cluster warhead by the Russians, and the entire convoy seems to have been, well, massively damaged, and perhaps most of the vehicles were destroyed, and, well, probably large numbers of men were wounded and killed. The decision to supply shells with cluster warheads to the Ukrainians has ended up benefiting the Russians, because as they warned, they have many more cluster warheads than the Americans do. The warheads they have are far more powerful, and of course they can install them on ballistic missiles, and by the way, on cruise missiles, which they possess and which the Ukrainians don't, and use them to deadly effect. So there we go. Now, I talked about these things. Maybe the moment has come to do a quick rundown of the situation on the battlefronts. Now, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the head of the Chechen regional government within the Russian Federation, has now made a statement saying that he expects that Volchansk will fall under Russian control fairly soon. Now, there's been limited information about what's going on in Volchansk for some days. Group of forces north has been telling us a lot less about the fighting in Volchansk recently. The latest updates they provided suggested that the Russians are making strong progress inside the area of the high-rise buildings, that they're clearing the citadel area fast, and that they have enlarged their bridgehead west of Volchansk, near the village of Bugrovata. There's now been some rather extraordinary film which appears to show the Ukrainians launching artillery strikes against Russian troops near Volchansk, except that the location appears to be well to the south of the Volga River. Now, that would suggest that the area of the high-rise buildings, the aggregate plant, the forested area in the loop of the Volga River, that all of that has now fallen under the Russian control, and that the Russians are indeed in the process of advancing themselves south of the Volga River into the remaining part of Volchansk that the Ukrainians still occupy. Now, I say all of that. There are some suggestions that the Ukrainian source that has provided this film has made a mistake. We'll have to see. But certainly Kadyrov's report seemed to be very optimistic. He seemed to think that Volchansk, the fighting for Volchansk, is going very strongly Russia's way. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, have launched their attack on the village of Glubovka near Lipsy. They seem to have wedged themselves deep inside this village. After numerous attempts to break through, they sent hundreds of men in an attack on this village. The fighting there seems to be incredibly intense. The Ukrainian troops are being shelled and bombed by the Russians relentlessly. The Russians are dropping enormous Fab 3,000 bombs on the Ukrainians in precisely this area. I have to say that not for the first time, this whole operation in Lipsy looks like a sideshow of a sideshow. The main battle is in Volchansk. I'm not sure what exactly it is that the Ukrainians think they can achieve in this area, but certainly if they do eventually recapture the village of Glubovka, I don't really see how that changes anything at all on the battlefronts. Now, there are reports of Russian advances everywhere else, right across the line of contact. And it's very difficult now to provide quick summaries of all of these advances. But suffice to say that the Russians have probably made more advances in the Chasiv Yar area, but they are definitely making significant progress in the Toretsk area. This major fortified position seems to be crumbling rapidly. And, well, there's lots of villages and suburbs of Toretsk that the Russians are attacking and occupying. For me, the most interesting development is that the Russians appear to have perfected the means of building tunnels under the Ukrainian fortifications. These are not pipes that they discover and then send their troops through. These are actual tunnels that they themselves dig. That they dig these tunnels under the Ukrainian fortifications, and that then enables them to insert special forces behind the fortifications, which then causes the entire Ukrainian fortified lines to start to collapse. And this has been apparently done on at least two occasions in the Toretsk area. It's important to remember, by the way, that Donbass is a coal mining region. Many of the Russian troops are obviously drawn from the Donbass militia and are former coal miners. So they have experience in mining operations, in underground tunneling and that kind of thing. So anyway, they've started to use this tactic very effectively in the Toretsk area. And, well, it is increasingly looking as if the Ukrainians are facing a very critical situation there. As I've said in previous programs, the Ukrainians have made effort after effort to stabilize the situation in Toretsk, but so far without any success. But as always, in my opinion, it is in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area that the Ukrainians are facing their real crisis. And, well, here we've started to get news that the Russians have now begun in a serious way their attack on Vozvyzhenka, northwest of the village of Novo-Alexandrovka. There's also reports that the Russians have either attacked or perhaps even captured another village west of Novo-Alexandrovka called Lozuvatska. And more importantly, perhaps, there are also reports that the reason that the Russians were able to capture Yevgenivka and are in the process of occupying Novoselivka Persha a little south is because, as I said earlier in the program, it looks as if the men of the Ukraine's elite 47th Mechanized Brigade decided to retreat from their positions in these two villages. And that, as I said, is very consequential. It suggests that the situation with morale of the Ukrainian troops is weakening rapidly as well. So, Yevgenivka, either fallen or about to fall. Sokol definitely having fallen. Novo-Alexandrovka firmly under Russian control. Lozuvatska either captured or about to be captured. If you look at a map, the Russians are now very close to Progress, the village that forms the outermost part of the Pokrovsk conurbation. And as we've discussed many times, if the Russians capture Vozvyzhenka, they're very close to the major road from Pokrovsk and Mirnograd, which leads on to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar further east. And it's likely that over the next couple of days, the battle for Vozvyzhenka will begin in earnest. So, a deteriorating situation. And I understand that in Krasnogorovka, somewhat to the west of these battles, this town which the Russians have been quietly advancing through over the last few days, they've now apparently occupied the football stadium and are in the process of clearing this large park area in the northern part of Krasnogorovka. As I said, the Russians have been taking their time in Krasnogorovka. But anyway, the town is being steadily and methodically cleared. So the Russians continuing to advance, launching missile strikes across Ukraine, very confident that the war is going steadily in their favor, and Ukrainian defenses all over the place. But Donald Tusk and Zelensky, by themselves, without apparently the major leaders of the West being involved, agreeing with each other, a plan which has the potential to bring further disaster upon the West. This is going to be a NATO summit meeting of ghosts, of pallid figures who have completely lost their way. In the meantime, President Putin himself is hosting Prime Minister Modi in Moscow. They had a meeting at Novo-Ogaryovo, Putin's country residence near Moscow. They exchanged incredibly friendly words with each other. I'll give briefly what Modi said. He said, "Visiting a friend in his home is a delight. You have invited me to your home. I would like to thank you for the interesting program of my visit and for your warm words. I greatly appreciate this." And then he talks about the elections, and he says, "You're right," that this is to Putin, that these elections, the Indian elections, are very important and huge in scale. India is the largest democracy. It is considered the mother of democracy. About 650 million people took part in the election. It is the first time in 60 years that a government has been elected for a third term in a row. The first time it happened was when India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was elected for a third term. I have done the same 60 years later. The people of India have given me a chance to serve my homeland. The people of India who have given this mandate to me. I have worked in government for 10 years and my principle is reform, perform, transform. So the Indian people voted for that principle, and I'm confident that I will work 3 times more during my third term. And then Putin replies, "You have devoted your whole life to serving the Indian people, and they are aware of that." And Modi responds, "You are right in that my only goal is to serve my country and my people." You can almost describe it as a kind of love fest between these two leaders. Zelensky himself is furious about this. He's complained angrily that it is a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow. Well, there we are. Zelensky had a chance with Modi. He met him at the G7 summit in Tokyo last year. The meeting went incredibly badly. Modi was apparently deeply offended by the way that Zelensky behaved. And so here he is in Moscow, embracing and being embraced by his dear friend, Vladimir Putin. And no doubt there will be many agreements and decisions made. I've discussed the nature of the issues, the financial issues that the two are going to discuss. There's an article about all of this in the Financial Times, by the way. People who think that these problems are intractable and beyond solution are simply wrong. That is all I'm going to say. But anyway, Modi and Putin meeting in Moscow, doing real things, as Modi said, reform, perform, and transform. Whereas in NATO, it's the meeting of the ghosts. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Please don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And don't forget also that you can check out our shop. You will find all sorts of amazing things there. We've got all kinds of special offers that you can find, and Football 24, for example, still underway, I believe. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.